Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you are here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading The Negro Pilgrimage in America by C. Eric Lincoln, starting on page 124.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
The current struggle. The executive branch of the government ended slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation. The legislative branch passed the 14th Amendment declaring the Negro a citizen, but the judicial branch evaded the earlier actions. In Scott versus Sanford, a case in 1857, the court held that a Negro had no rights a white man was required to respect. 39 years later, the court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson established the doctrine of separate but equal facilities for Negroes and whites. These two monumental rulings from the nation's highest tribunal forebode second-class citizenship for the Negro American. However, in recent years, the Supreme Court has become the institution most reflective of the pervading spirit of American democracy and less reflective of the passing mood of the times. This change is most dramatically illustrated in the areas of voting rights, interstate travel, and schooling. Voting rights. For years, Negroes were effectively disenfranchised from the so-called white primary. By excluding Negroes from voting in its primary elections, Southern Democrats nullified any vote a Negro might cast in the general election. Negroes were also excluded from participation in the conventions, caucuses, and mass meetings of the party. And of course, they could not run for office. The white primary fell before the court's 1944 decision in Smith versus Allwright. The decision declared that the primary election was an integral part of the governmental election machinery and that it was unconstitutional for it to be operated on a racial basis. Even with the decision in Smith versus Allwright, the Negroes' right to an effective exercise of the ballot was not and has not been cleared. The remaining problem has been formidable: how to overcome the many barriers that keep Negroes off the voting list altogether. Until 1957, the Department of Justice could not legally protect the right to vote. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960 have given the department such authority, and with the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the provisions of which have been upheld by the Supreme Court, the federal government has the unquestionable legal means to enforce and protect the voting rights of all American citizens in states, territories, or other political subdivisions which have discriminatory voting regulations. Signed by President Johnson on August 6 of 1965, the Voting Rights Act 1 suspends literacy tests and other devices found to be discriminatory as qualifications for voting in the states of Alabama, Alaska, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Virginia, and at least 26 counties in North Carolina. 2, provides for the assignment of federal examiners to see that registration is conducted on an open basis and, if need be, to conduct the registration themselves. 3, directs the U.S. Attorney General to bring suits immediately to test the constitutionality of poll taxes which abridge the right to vote. And 4, extends protection under civil and criminal law to qualified persons seeking to vote and those who urge or aid others to vote. Some of the areas covered by the Act do not have records for voting rights discrimination, but do have laws on their books which could be used for this purpose. The real struggle and the area at which the bill is directed is in the hardcore Southern states, which have consistently prevented Negroes from voting. The fight for actual equal rights has not yet been won. Actually, the Voting Rights Act sets the groundwork for a hard and long fight. The fact that there are laws on the books protecting the Negro's right to vote does not mean that there will no longer be attempts to prevent him from using it. The Negro still faces intimidation and the possible failure of careful enforcement of the laws. While there is no question that a major victory has been won in the passing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, only the future will reveal the success or failure of America to fulfill its commitment. Greetings for KW Don 7. How are you tonight? Interstate travel. With better mass transportation, America has become increasingly mobile, and accommodations for the traveler have become matters of public necessity. A seat on a train or bus rest facilities in bus and train stations and airports and facilities in motels and hotels have become as important as owning an automobile or house. White Americans take for granted the availability of such accommodations, but for years they were frequently unavailable to Negro travelers. Traditionally, railways, bus stations, and airport facilities all over the South were segregated. Negroes traveling north were required to sit in segregated railway coaches until the trains crossed the historical division between North and South, the Mason-Dixon line. Traveling south, Negroes on crossing the line had to leave their seats in order to be more comfortable in the coaches they shared with white riders and transfer to older, less comfortable coaches. Pullman accommodation was not available to Negroes in most Southern cities, as this would have required their traveling in intimate proximity with white passengers. Similar restrictions operated against Negroes in the use of buses traveling within and between Southern states. In 1944, a Negro passenger refused to give up her seat and moved to the rear of the bus operated by the Virginia Greyhound lines. She was convicted of violating Virginia's segregation laws. The Supreme Court reversed the conviction in Morgan versus Virginia, citing the need for uniformity in regulation of interstate commerce. Since at least 18 states forbade segregation and at least 10 required it, it seemed unreasonable and unnecessary burden on the passengers and carriers to require compliance with differing local segregation laws as public vehicles moved from state to state. 6 years later, in Henderson versus the United States, the court struck down an Interstate Commerce Commission, an ICC, ruling requiring Negro passengers in railroad dining cars to eat behind a curtain, separating them from other passengers in the diner. Various devices were employed by both railroads and buses in attempts to subvert both Morgan and Henderson decisions. In 1955, the ICC also ordered the end of segregated facilities in bus and train terminal buildings. Desegregation of universities. Free public education is one of the fundamental rights of the American citizen. But for several reasons, Negroes have not shared fully in this right. Lack of economic means has historically been the impediment to a well-educated Negro minority, and apathy caused by the feeling that education is useless because it does not lead to commensurate employment has stifled the normal incentive of tens of thousands of Negro boys and girls. Resentment, too, has taken its toll, consuming energies that might have gone into learning and creative expression. There have been other reasons for the Negro's lag in education, not the least of which has been the dearth of and poor quality of public school facilities available to non-whites. From 1896 until 1954, the separate but equal doctrine enunciated in Plessy versus Ferguson was the philosophy regulating educational facilities for Negroes throughout the South and in many border states as well. 4 important opportunities to repudiate the Plessy doctrine came before the courts in the 2 decades leading up to the historic desegregation cases of 1954. In these 4 cases, the courts kept within the doctrine, but gradually whittled away its original meaning. In the first of these cases, argued in 1935, Donald Murray, a Negro graduate of Amherst College, was denied admission to the University of Maryland Law School solely because of his race. The university offered instead to pay Murray's tuition at any other law school that would accept him. The Maryland Court of Appeals found that requirement found the requirement that he leave the state and forego the advantages inherent in studying law in Maryland, where he planned to practice, to be de facto inequality under the Plessy rule. Equal treatment can be furnished only in the existing University of Maryland Law School. The court held and ordered Murray admitted forthwith. In 1938, Lloyd Gaines, a Negro who had been denied admission to the University of Missouri Law School, was ordered admitted because the state of Missouri did not provide separate but equal law schools for Negroes. Gaines did not reap the fruits of his Supreme Court victory, for he mysteriously disappeared very soon after the decision was handed down. His fate has never been determined. Forewarned by the decisions in Maryland and Missouri cases, several Southern states moved hastily to set up segregated law schools for Negroes. None of them was equal to the white schools maintained by the states in terms of physical plant, libraries, or teaching faculties. So Negroes continued to sue for admission to the better schools. In a 1950 suit involving the University of Texas Law School, Sweat versus Painter, the complainant, supported by briefs submitted by the United States government, contended that the separate but equal doctrine laid down 54 years earlier in Plessy versus Ferguson should be disavowed. The defendants, backed by pro segregation arguments presented by the attorneys general of 11 southern states, urged the Supreme Court to endorse the Plessy Doctrine and to make it specifically applicable to all areas of public education. The court refused to adopt either of the positions urged upon it, but did rule that state supported segregated law school for Negroes was not equal to the white University of Texas school. Its decision involved an important extension of the concept of equality, for the court held that the University of Texas Law School possessed certain intangible qualities lacking in the segregated institution that make for greatness in a law school. It was becoming increasingly clear that equality could not be limited to bricks and mortar, or even an equal number of teachers with commensurate degrees and experience. Equality involved the uninhabited interactions both of people and with institutions. It meant the opportunity for the normal range of social and intellectual experiences that are possible only in an open society. The court had thus moved closer to the inevitable conclusion that equality cannot abide the forced separation of human beings on the basis of the color of their skins. In McLaurin versus the Board of Regents, decided the same day as the Sweat case, the Supreme Court took yet another step toward restoring to the Negro his civil rights and his human dignity. The court now ruled that a Negro student who had been admitted to the graduate school of the University of Oklahoma could not be required to eat, study, or attend classes under segregated conditions. McLaurin had been assigned a colored seat in each classroom and had been further humiliated by being required to eat in a designated table of the school cafeteria. A segregated table had been set aside for him in the library. The court ruled that while individuals were free to avoid association with McLaurin, the state could not impose such restrictions, which prohibit the intellectual commingling of students. The Plessy Doctrine still stood, but it was no longer intact. Little by little, its once broad applications were being eroded. On a historic Monday in May of 1954, the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson would be destroyed forever. Desegregation of the schools. In failing to repudiate the separate but equal doctrine in the law school cases, the court quite properly observed the long established practice of refusing to rule on questions not directly relevant to the case under adjudication. The issues in the law school cases were solely a matter of whether the separate provisions for the education of Negroes were, in fact, equal to those for whites. The question of whether anything separate could, by definition, also be equal was not then in litigation. In the early 50s, however, the court was faced with precisely this question in a series of suits seeking to enable Negro children to attend public schools, then closed to them on racial grounds. The Supreme Court tribunal was now called upon to either broaden unequivocally the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson, or to extend the liberalizing principles of the Sweat and McLaurin cases to their logical extremes, either to find segregated primary and secondary schools to be unconstitutional, or to find all segregated schools to be unconstitutional. This was the significance of the case of Brown versus the Board of Education, decided on May 17th of 1954. In its decision, the court first noted that education is perhaps the most important function of the state. It is the very foundation of good citizenship and a principal instrument in awakening the child to cultural values, in preparing him for later professional training, and in helping him to adjust normally to his environment. The opportunity of an education, which the state has undertaken to provide, is a right which must be available to all on equal terms. The court then defined its issues before it. The segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race, even though the physical facilities and other tangible factors may be equal, deprive the child of the minority group of equal educational opportunities. Said the court, we believe that it does. The unanimous decision was a final and certain requiem for Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, the court ruled. And in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. And that's why private schools and charter schools are on the rise. But anyway, continuing. Principle extended. The decision of the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education rests primarily upon the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees to all citizens equal protection under the law. In the companion case of Bowling versus Sharp involving segregation in the public schools of the District of Columbia, the court broadened its constitutional base to include the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment, holding that racial discrimination is a denial of the due process of law. It is upon these two constitutional provisions that much of the civil rights litigation of recent years has been based. The five suits comprising the Brown versus Board of Education are so-called class actions, for they affect not only the rights of the original plaintiffs, but also those of all other Americans, whatever race, who are similarly concerned. The Brown case was specifically directed at segregation in public elementary and high schools. Its principle was extended to the field of higher education in 1956 in the case of Florida X related to Hawkins versus Board of Control, in which the Supreme Court ordered Virgil Hawkins, a 48-year-old Negro, admitted to the College of Law of the University of Florida without delay. Within 2 years of the Brown case, the principle of the inherent inequality of racially segregated facilities had been extended to parks and playgrounds, housing, transportation, and many other aspects of American life in which segregation had been traditional. On Monday, May 17, 1954, and that was an auspicious day for the future of American democracy. It was the day America cleared its conscience and began the long road back to the shrine of its founding principles. The South reacts. Within a few weeks of the historic decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, the first White Citizens Council was organized in Mississippi. You see what they did? They organized themselves immediately. We need to learn that trick. Allied units and independent councils were soon organized in every southern state, and a massive campaign to oppose the implementation of the court's ruling was soon underway. The primary targets of the White Citizens Council have been individual Negroes who advocate desegregation or who participate in petitions, lawsuits, or other activities aimed at the elimination of segregation. White liberals have also found themselves the objects of vituperation, or the angst and frustration of these white citizens council members. The principal weapon used to discourage desegregation has been economic reprisal. Negroes suspected of membership in the NAACP have in some areas been fired from their jobs if they were employed by whites. Whites who supported desegregation or who refused to fire Negro employees, then ordered to do so by the councils, have had their businesses boycotted and their families harassed and intimidated. In some areas, in Mississippi in particularly, Negroes have been murdered in mysterious circumstances and others have been beaten by unknown assailants. Many Negro churches and homes have been bombed and burned. The councils disclaim responsibility for any violence Negro integrationists have suffered, but their common identification with the Ku Klux Klan and the frequency of overlapping memberships with the Klan make such disavowals questionable. In those areas in which the council's strength is greatest, they have created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation sufficient to frighten some Negroes and to silence many respectable white people. But even in Mississippi, where their Gestapo like influence is greatest, the councils have been unable to frighten or silence all the people. Negroes still insist upon enjoying the full privileges of citizenship, and they are still supported in their efforts by significant numbers of whites. Indeed, the influence of the White Citizens Council has dropped sharply, except for Mississippi. And although they still have some power in Alabama and Louisiana, more moderate elements are in control elsewhere in the South. One of the more frightening aspects of the reaction of white Southerners to the drive for civil rights has been the increase in the power of the Ku Klux Klans. There is no longer one unified Klan. There are rather a number of clans, each having similar objectives but being different in leadership and control of different geographical areas. While it is true that in a few areas of the South, more moderate elements have reduced the power of the clans, it is still all too common that as the white citizens' councils lose power, the clans move in and find ready acceptance or complete apathy on the part of the responsible white community. The clans have become the symbol and instrument of last-ditch resistance to change. Greetings, forecast, and KW97. I promise I'll change it tomorrow. Desegregation, peaceful and violent. When the decision in the Brown case was announced on May 17, 1954, the governors in some states, which were Delaware, Tennessee, North Carolina, Kentucky, Maryland, and Oklahoma among them, issued public statements announcing their expectations that the Supreme Court's interpretation of the law would be respected and the court's requirements put into operation. In the Deep South, however, the court's ruling was denounced by most governors. Governor Talmadge of Georgia declared that integration would never take place in his state. The governor of Mississippi hastily summoned 100 Negro leaders to a conference at which he offered them a plan for voluntary segregation. When the Negroes issued a statement declaring themselves unalterably opposed to any effort to attempt to circumvent the decision of the Supreme Court, the governor described himself as stunned that the Negroes of his state would adopt such an attitude. In the fall of 1954, four large cities, which were Washington, D.C., Wilmington, St. Louis, and Baltimore, began to desegregate their public schools. At least 40 smaller towns and cities followed suit. Within a year, more than half of the counties of West Virginia desegregated some or all of their schools. In Arizona and Kansas, segregated schools were virtually eliminated. In Pasadena, California, and in more than 100 school districts in Missouri, the schools were quickly integrated. Negroes were not only the beneficiaries of this trend, for New York's state practice of segregating Indian school children had finally discontinued. Nowhere did the efforts to resist integration succeed. Just as the schools of Delaware were integrated, so were the schools at Clinton, Sturgis, Nashville, Little Rock, and New Orleans integrated. Despite racist agitators in the capital city of Georgia, where Governor Griffin had promised that no integration would take place, desegregation did. In fact, come with little more than a ripple in the everyday life of the Atlanta metropolis. In the big cities of Dallas, Memphis, Houston, integration came quietly after the troublemakers were warned that they would go to jail. 8 years after the Brown decision, desegregation had taken place in 948 school districts. In only a handful had there been any significant resistance. Little Rock. The American Negro often complains that he is judged by the worst behavior of the least responsible members of his group, and that his judges do not consider all the facts. Similarly, Little Rock, Arkansas has been unfairly represented internationally. It is not generally known outside of the South that prior to the unfortunate events surrounding the desegregation of Central High School in the autumn of 1957, Little Rock was considered a liberal town by most Southern Negroes and whites. Evidence supports that point of view. In the first place, despite its relatively low standard of living, the state of Arkansas had taken a notable lead among its sister states in the South, abandoning the traditional practice of total segregation. As early as 1948, Arkansas had voluntarily admitted Negroes to the graduate division of the state university, the first Southern state to do so of its own accord. In 1954, the public schools at Fayetteville and Charleston were desegregated, as were Roman Catholic or private schools at Fort Smith and Paris. A year later, the public schools at Hoxie and all state-supported undergraduate colleges discarded segregation. There were no incidents. By 1955, Negroes in Arkansas had made significant gains in employment areas usually reserved in the South for whites. There were Negro guards at the Pine Bluff Arsenal. Business firms throughout the state had begun to hire Negro salesmen. The hospitals in the larger cities employed both white and Negro nurses. Some scout troops and scout facilities, scout camp facilities were integrated. Some county medical societies and labor unions had quietly dispensed with Jim Crow practices. The American Association of University Women accepted Negro members, but they were probably all tokens in those areas. Because if you hire one, or if you put one in there, then that means that you've integrated. Speaking of tokens, by the same token, the Arkansas Council on Human Relations had published a manual on desegregation for the use of school districts soon to be involved in this new way of living and learning together. In the city of Little Rock itself, Negroes and whites had long enjoyed amicable relations. Integrated meetings and conferences were frequently held in the best hotels in the city. Although Negroes were not yet accepted as overnight guests, it seemed likely that such restrictions were soon to be dropped. Full library services were available to all Little Rock citizens, irrespective of race. Just because a service is available doesn't mean that you actually have access to it. Because if someone is blocking the door or threatening you if you go in there, then you don't have access even though it's available. Full library services were available to all Little Rock citizens, irrespective of race, and Negroes attended the city sponsored symphony concerts and other cultural events without inconvenience of any kind because they will take your money, but that doesn't mean they see you as an equal. By 1957, the Little Rock School Board was ready to begin the voluntary program of gradual desegregation on which it had been working since 1954. They had been working on this for 3 years. The plan envisioned desegregation of senior high school grades in September of 1957, with desegregation of the lower grades to be completed within 6 years. In February 1957, the Arkansas legislature passed 4 segregation bills designed to circumvent desegregation. These bills were all signed by Governor Orville Faubus. However, in dramatic public support of the school board's plans, the citizens of Little Rock went to the polls in March and by decisive majorities elected to the school board 2 men who were publicly committed to the desegregation plan. Little Rock thus announced to the world that it was ready to comply with the law of the land, but that they remove the governor at that time or in his next election is the question. Did they remove the governor? Because people like to see people argue politically. So just because they elected 2 school board members who were men and were publicly committed to the desegregation plan doesn't mean that they cut off the head of the snake and elected a new governor. What happened subsequently was an unfortunate and inaccurate reflection on a majority of the people of Little Rock and Arkansas. Blame for the trouble that followed in Little Rock and in the other cities of the South must probably rest in part upon 77 United States representatives and 19 senators from the South who issued the unfortunate 1956 Southern Manifesto denouncing the Supreme Court's decisions of 1954. The so-called manifesto did much to encourage dissident elements in the several states of the South to question the legality of the court's ruling and to defy its desegregation orders. Another event contributing to the defiance of the segregationists in Little Rock was the appearance in that city of Georgia's Governor Marvin Griffin. Griffin, a rabid segregationist, went to Little Rock to address a white citizens council rally in late August. just 1 week before desegregation was scheduled to take place at Central High School. So he went there to hype them up. Governor Faubus, who was considered a moderate by both whites and Negroes, telephoned Governor Griffin 2 days before his scheduled appearance and requested that he not come to Little Rock if his address was likely to increase racial tensions. Despite his assurances to Governor Faubus, Griffin delivered an inflammatory speech that perceptibly increased the feeling against desegregation in Little Rock. At what point the governor of Arkansas stopped being a moderate and became a segregationist is difficult to determine, but Governor Faubus evidently made his transition. His behavior in calling out the National Guard to turn away Negro students from Central High School saddened America and shocked the world. Little Rock thus became a symbol of the frictions and abrasions of social change. But Little Rock is not the true face of America, nor is New Orleans or Oxford, Mississippi, or Birmingham or Selma, Alabama. These cities in turmoil represent one aspect of life in America as America attempts to work out its problems of readjustment between the races. America's efforts to make the democratic values of this society meaningful to all the people are frequently tardy and sometimes lacking in dynamism. But the efforts have been made and they have been approved by most of the people. However difficult social adjustment may be, the democratic process must prevail. It did prevail in Little Rock and it will prevail in all similar cases. The rise of civil rights groups. Miss Rosa Parks was comfortable in the bus seat she occupied on December 1st of 1955. Her refusal to move to a segregated seat in the back of the vehicle signaled one of the most successful campaigns for dignity Negroes have ever waged in the South. It also brought into existence the Montgomery Improvement Association, headed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., with Dr. King and Reverend Ralph Abernathy providing leadership. The Negroes of Montgomery, Alabama mounted a 100% effective boycott against Montgomery's Jim Crow city bus system. The Negroes demanded two acts by the city: the end to segregated seating on buses and the employment of Negro drivers on routes moving through Negro neighborhoods. The economic effect of the boycott brought the bus company to the conference table in an attempt to reach a settlement. Negotiations soon broke off and the Negroes took their cause to court. A federal district court ruled on June 5, 1956, that segregation on local public transportation violated both the due process and the equal protection of the law. Provisions of the 14th Amendment, almost a year after Miss Parks' arrest in the original incident, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the lower court's decision. In December of 1956, Montgomery, Alabama desegregated its entire public transportation system. The Montgomery boycott demonstrated the power of organized effort by Negroes in Southern communities. Early in 1957, Dr. King and other church leaders formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. The hallmark of the SCLC activity is nonviolence, and Dr. King's steadfast devotion to this principle lifted him to international prominence. Those people were nonviolent, but they were protected by Deacons for Defense and people that had guns and weapons. Always remember that, because just because they're operating in a nonviolent manner and accepting the abuse, remember that they have somebody watching their back, and the people knew that. In 1964, he became the second Negro American to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The struggle for Negro rights has taken many forms and has involved at least four major organizations in addition to the SCLC. The NAACP, or the National Council for the Association for the Advancement of Colored People, has been in the forefront of legal battles for civil rights for more than half a century. Today, it has grown to an organization of nearly 500,000 members in the 50 states of the Union. Its board of directors and national staff are interracial and always have been. It was started by Jews. The NAACP presidents have been white traditionally. You see that? White, Jewish. While the executive secretaries or executive directors have usually, he writes always, but have usually been Negroes. Its legal defense and educational fund have was long headed by Thurgood Marshall, established an impressive record of success in civil rights cases, with approximately 11 victories for each loss in the United States Supreme Court. And that's why they made him a judge, because they couldn't beat him. That's why they made him a Supreme Court judge, because they couldn't beat him at their own game. So they won him over to their side. Although it is known primarily for its legal activity in prosecuting civil rights cases, the NAACP also sponsors several programs designed to educate the public concerning race relations. It also supports and opposes legislation affecting one moment, the civil rights movement, and defends direct action such as protest demonstrations. The association's educational program seeks to create positive settings for legal and social change by participating and preparing both whites and Negroes in specific communities to accept such changes with a minimum of conflict. Whites are urged to comply with the law, and Negroes are trained to utilize existing rights of citizenship in such areas as voting, federal employment, and education. Under the guidance of the late Walter White, its first executive secretary, and more recently, executive director Roy Wilkins, the NAACP has grown in influence, membership, and public acceptance. Second to appear on the scene was the National Urban League, which has pioneered in helping the Negro to make the transition from rural to urban life. Although not a mass membership organization like the NAACP and other civil rights groups, the Urban League's concern for the urban Negro has played an important part in the latter's orientation and adjustment to city life. Led by Whitney Young Jr., the League's executive director, important programs in social welfare, on the job training, housing, and education have been carried out quietly and effectively. There is an Urban League office in almost every city with a large Negro population. The year 1942 saw the founding in Chicago of the Congress of Racial Equality, but it was not until the 1950s that this group began to reach national proportions. Its first leader and founder was James Farmer, under whose militant leadership CORE moved to the forefront of the civil rights struggle. In 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, initiated a new technique. It sent hundreds of volunteers to the South to test segregation laws in interstate transportation and terminal facilities. These protesters became known as Freedom Riders. Led by Farmer himself, these Freedom Riders numbered at times more than 1,000 Negroes and whites. The final result was that desegregation of interstate transportation and the rise of a new militant, nonviolent protesters. In February of 1966, Farmer left his post of leadership to take a leading position in the newly founded National Center for Community Action and Education, Incorporated. By 1960, there was a stirring among many young people throughout the nation. The call went out for a new and dynamic militancy which would not be satisfied with words or promises. Their call was freedom now and not tomorrow. For this group, even the more radical civil rights movements like CORE were not enough, and thus, in 1960, various students' protest groups founded SNCC, or SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The original meeting was called by Dr. King, but the students felt his proposals were too moderate. The new student movement directed its action to the heart of the nation's problems. Its members moved in to live and work with the people who were and are being denied their freedom. Most of their limited money and personnel has been directed toward the South, where the problems are most pressing, but their militancy was spread to all parts of the country. They bring with them a dedication and energy which is aimed at awakening the poor and oppressed. They have shown and continue to show themselves willing to accept the same hardships and suffering of the people they are trying to help. They have faced violence, jail, and even death to bring freedom to the Negro. They have been a moving force behind the drive for equal rights and public accommodations, making wide use of the now famous sit in technique. More recently, they have fought, along with other civil rights workers, for voting rights and for economic and social nonviolent resolution among the Negroes and whites of this country. Another view of race relations, the Black Muslims. The Black Muslims have been, for the last 10 years, one of the most controversial Black nationalist groups in America. The center of the movement is Chicago, where its present leader, Elijah Muhammad, spiritual head of the Muslims in the West, lives and directs the faithful. There are temples in almost every major city in America. They have had, until recently, particularly strong support in New York City, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and Chicago. The movement had its beginnings in 1930. A Muslim known as W.D. Fard, whose origins are unknown, appeared in Detroit and began teaching his own brand of Islamism. The major tenets of his teaching were that the white man and the white man's religion, Christianity, are evil, and that the Black man, by following Fard's interpretation of the religion of Islam, is destined to destroy the white devils at some future battle of Armageddon. The movement grew slowly at first, gaining some support among Negroes in Black ghettos. You got to remember, at the end of the day, they worship a white man, but that's neither here nor there. 3 years after Fard founded the movement, he vanished. There is little information about his disappearance as there is about his appearance in Detroit 3 years earlier. He was succeeded by one of his closest assistants, Elijah Muhammad, born Elijah Poole. Muhammad still directs the movement from his headquarters in Chicago, although his public appearances are less frequent than formerly. Under his leadership, the movement grew from 2 to 70 or 80 mosques. Following the strict policy of isolation from the white man's world, the Black Muslims have established their own temples and schools, apartment houses and stores, restaurants, and farms. Closely connected with this system of isolation is the conviction that they are more than the equals of the white man. They are Black men with a manifest destiny under the leadership of a Black God. And that's what draws people in because there's nothing wrong with that. You're supposed to have that. Although the Black Muslims officially maintain that they avoid bloodshed, they have periodically been involved in outbreaks of violence. They are strict believers in the doctrine of an eye for an eye, and each Muslim vows to avenge himself for any overt aggression against himself or any of his brothers. Since 1964, however, the Black Muslims have been losing ground and schisms have developed within the movement. Much of their appeal to the traditional Negro hatred of white society has been lessened as the nonviolent civil rights groups have helped to bring about improved conditions and relations with the white community. As the leaders of federal, state, and local governments have given way to the spirit of change, many Negroes have begun to hope that there are better answers to their problems than a chauvinistic separatism. I don't know if we hope that a chauvinistic separatism is the only option. I think that there are some good points about it and there are some bad points about it. You have to eat the meat and spit out the bones. You have to take what you can from it, such as the fact that they have created their own parallel society with organizations and institutions to sustain their people. And they have totally created a system where they can have an economy. Malcolm X. Perhaps the most striking and interesting figure to emerge from the Black Muslim movement was Malcolm X. In his short career, he became the most articulate spokesman for the Black Muslims and for the many smaller Black nationalist organizations. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little, one of 11 children, in Omaha, Nebraska, in about 1925. Later, the family moved to Lansing, Michigan, where his father, a Baptist minister, soon incurred the hostility of his white neighbors because he was so outspoken on racial issues. His parents were Garveyites. His parents were Garveyites. KW Don 7 says the Black Muslims never avenged Ronald Stokes. Exactly. Malcolm X's parents were Garveyites. So that's why they were so outspoken on racial issues. Malcolm was only 6 when the family home was burned by the Ku Klux Klan and his father doggedly rebuilt it in the same neighborhood. In what appeared to be an accident, Mr. Little was killed. Malcolm, however, always believed that he was murdered by his white enemies. The bitterness of these early years remained with Malcolm until the last years before his murder. Malcolm X's life was an interesting one. From Lansing, he went to Harlem, where he learned the ins and outs of the dope racket, the numbers game, bootlegging whiskey, and diverse forms of hustling. He was finally arrested and jailed in the maximum security prison at Concord, Massachusetts in 1947. While in prison, Malcolm was converted by one of his brothers who had become a member of Muhammad's Detroit temple. Give me one moment. From then until his split with the movement and Elijah Muhammad's 1964, From then until his split with the movement and Elijah Muhammad in 1964, Malcolm gave all his time and energies to the Black Muslims. When he left the Black Muslims, he tried to build a new movement based on his unique and still developing philosophy of race relations, human rights, and revolution. In his view, the white man and the white power structure were still the enemy, but he now felt that it was possible to work with civil rights groups to solve some of the most pressing problems facing the Negro. And he conceded it was also possible for whites to join with him if they completely accept the necessity for eventual revolution and overthrow of the white power structure if, that is, they could give up the psychological fact of their whiteness. Malcolm X is a symbol of the two alternatives Americans face today: a peaceful solution to the racial problem with Negroes and whites working earnestly together, or hatred, violence, and open warfare. We're going to put a pin in it right there. I know we said we were going to finish this book today, but unfortunately, I know that forecast goes live at 8:30 tonight. So we're going to read the last three chapters tomorrow. They are short. They're all about 4 pages long, but I won't be done by 8:30. I want to thank each and every one of you for listening. I am going to change that battery. I'm going to get up there as soon as we get offline. I didn't notice it before. You don't notice it when you hear it all day, and I apologize for that. I know that I thank you for being here, KW Don 7 and Forecast. I know that Denial is listening. I know that Sister Raw and the elders are listening. I know that Brother Bakari is listening. I know that Bawana Haguziki is listening. All of y'all talking about me and my smoke alarm that needs to be changed. I know that Dorico Cooper is listening. I know that the staff at the Daycare Ladies Network and the staff at Jesse's Kids are listening. I know that Dorico Cooper is listening, and so is Tinkerbell87. I know that Anthony McPhail is listening. I know that Koku from the Bitter Medicine podcast is listening. And I know that Oni from the Pro Black Perspective is listening. And you, even you, if you drop your name in the comments, I will shout you out too. I thank each and every one of you for being here today. And I will see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Peace, guys.